Morning, everybody. Dr. Gillard here once again. It's week 4. It is Tuesday morning, and it's time for part 2 of week 4 endocrinology. So here we go. And in preparation for Addisons Disease, which is coming up probably next week, we'll get to that. This isn't too long of a lecture. But we should do just a little bit of basic stuff. Let's talk a little bit about the adrenal gland. I know we talked a little bit. And then we're going to talk a lot about ACTH. So adrenal glands, of course, there they are, sit on top of the kidney. It's made up of 2 regions. It has an outer region called the cortex, which is right here. It has a capsule that has no endocrine tissue, no cells, no endocrine tissue in it. But then the cortex has a lot of 3 layers, right? And then we have a medulla layer in here. So outer cortex, about 3/4 of the mass of the adrenal gland. And then we have a inner medullary region. What's the cells of the medullary region? What do they secrete? Okay, catecholamines, mainly epinephrine and norepinephrine. Those are the enterochromaffin cells. Chromaffin cells. Talked about those already, didn't we? Here's the real adrenal gland. And there's a real kidney, real fresh cadaver, double artery to the kidney. There's the renal vein. There's that renal artery we talk, either one of those. There's the aorta. We're always talking about stenosis of the renal artery. There it is. In this specimen, it's fairly small. So it's a double. It's not always a double, though. Key to life. Can you live without the adrenal cortex? Absolutely not. In fact, no creature on the planet can live without their adrenal gland because of 2 hormones, namely the adrenal steroid hormones. But namely, what are the 2 you really need to live? Cortisol and aldosterone. You can live without DHEA, which comes from zona reticularis. You can't live without steroids. Can't live without cortisol. You can't live without aldosterone. Right, here's a little better breakdown. I always remember and this is easy board stuff, right? You can't miss a question like this on boards. What are the 3 layers of the adrenal cortex? I always remember GFR. Remember the glomerular filtration rate? I'm sure Dr. Doe talked a lot about that. We can use that same GFR. So G for zona glomerulosa, zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. So that's how I remember it. They're made up of the same name cells. Zona glomerulosa is made up of glomerulosa cells. Zona fasciculata is made up of fasciculata cells. Zona reticularis is made up of reticular cells, or reticular cells, they're sometimes called. Most of the time, they just call them cells of the zona reticularis. So zona glomerulosa is basically independent of these 2. Here's a question for you. You guys think you know this stuff? Who stimulates all 3 of these layers? Name me one molecule or one hormone that can stimulate all 3 of these. See if you're ready for this. Anybody get it? Yeah, Adrenocorticotropic Hormone, ACTH. Mainly stimulates the zona fasciculata, zona reticularis. A little bit of it stimulates glomerulosa cells as well. So for full power release of aldosterone, I think we talked about that. You need ACTH. Okay, and let's see. Who's the biggest chunk of all of the adrenal cortex? The zona fasciculata. I want to say it's about 70%, 75%. And the innermost region is, of course, the zona reticularis. Fasciculata makes up the bulk of it. These 2 function together pretty much, although they secrete different things. Here's a nice cartoon of the capsule and then the zona glomerulosa and the massive zona fasciculata. And then about the same size. There's some differences. I can't remember the exact breakdown, but zona reticularis, and there's the medulla in there. Right, we're good with that. All right, so what do you call collectively the hormones that come out of the adrenal cortex? Call them adrenocortical hormones, or more affectionately, the adrenal steroids. Adrenal steroids, that's how you talk about them collectively. Who are the adrenal steroids? Because they're all based on the steroid molecule, right, in biochemistry. We have mineralocorticoids, glucocorticoids, and the AAs, the adrenal androgens. And they come from those three layers, right? We'll look at that, though. I won't spoil my slides. Let's go through them. Mineralocorticoids, so that comes from the zona glomerulosa, secreted by glomerulosa cells. This is, why are these called mineralocorticoids? Aldosterone is the main one. Mineral, because potassium, these regulate sodium-potassium balance, which are considered minerals. That's why it gets that name. Aldosterone is the key one. We've talked a lot about that. There is another one, deoxycorticosterone is also the other one, which is very potent, but it's not as much as produced. Aldosterone is more prevalent. And that's all we'll say about that for right now. The glucocorticoids, they come from the zona fasciculata, the second zone, GFR, the second zone down. And the key molecule is cortisol. When you say glucocorticoids, you could almost use cortisol as an AKA. But there is another one, corticosterone, which is also potent, but it's not as much produced, but it's out there as well. More animals use it a little more than we do. And its job, it has a whole cortisol. Glucocorticoids have a very large function. But if you have to boil it down to one, it's keeping blood glucose levels normal. It's maintaining carbohydrate reserves and keeping blood glucose levels normal. If you have a big stressful event, you burn up glucose like crazy, and cortisol is released like crazy to combat that stress and make sure you tap your reserves, whether they be glycogen or muscle or fat, wherever you're going to get the glucose from. That's the job of cortisol, one of the jobs. And we'll look a lot at cortisol in the week, probably next week. And let's not forget that we also learned that cortisol does help shut off ADH secretion. It's not a major function, but it does shut off ADH, right? Because we said in cortisol deficiency, some people get an overproduction of ADH. Okay, comes from the zona fasciculata. We said that already. And then the adrenal androgens, not but last need. Do you need these ones to live? You can live without these. May cause some, well, there's actually studies on that. Some people don't worry about replacement, and people with like Addisons Disease. Some people don't worry about replacing these. Other researchers believe yes, and we'll get to that when that time comes. But the key, just like cortisol and aldosterone, the key hormone that's released from the zona fasciculata or zona reticularis is DHEA, or dehydroepiandrosterone. Dehydroepiandrosterone is the way you say that. Androsterone, DHEA. DHEA is converted into DHEAS, or dehydroepiandrosterone sulfate, which has a few different effects than ADH. But ADH is the main one. There's another one that's also made, androstenedione. So androstenedione. And these, again, are not essential for life, and they come from that third layer down, the zona reticularis, from reticular cell or reticular cells. Are we good so far? The function of these adrenal androgens, very similar to that of the gonadal hormones, testosterone and estrogens. In fact, these adrenal androgens, you can make testosterone and both of the estrogens from DHEA. I'll show you in a second the chart, the flow chart. Who are the estrogens? That is estradiol and estrone are the two estrogens. And amongst other things they do, they during anarchy, when you start becoming mature, probably around 12 or so, they start, or the zona reticularis starts secreting a lot more DHEA, and it's responsible for pubic hair growth, for one, and have a role in fetal development. And ovaries secrete a little DHEA too, about 20%. So you do lose a little testosterone because that's converted into testosterone in women. So after you go through menopause and you lose that function, you do lose a little bit of testosterone in females. Here is the chart. And we'll talk about this more as we go through this, because 21-hydroxylase is a really important enzyme, a 21-hydroxylase deficiency. So we will be talking about that more. So I do like this chart. Everything starts from cholesterol into pregnenolone. Pregnenolone can go into anything. It can go over here into 17-alpha-hydroxypregnenolone. And then here's our DHEA. And this is the main molecule that's created. And this would be happening, this pathway would be happening in each of the tissues. So this, in the zona reticularis, the same pathway would be going on. It can be converted into DHEAS, and that can be converted back. There's the two enzymes that do that, but you don't have to worry about those enzymes. But then you go into androstenedione is converted next. Androstenedione is converted into testosterone. It can be converted backwards by a two-way enzyme, this dehydrogenase enzyme. Or you can also take the androstenedione and via amylase, you can make esterone. That's one of the estrogens. And esterone can be converted into estradiol if you want. And you can go back and forth between those enzymes through the 17-keto reductase. Right? If you want, you can make estradiol as well. So I'm not going to... I know you guys are going, oh my God, I can't memorize this. I don't want to memorize. You should memorize some of these key steps for sure. Like you should know DHEA ends up becoming testosterone, which is converted into the two estrogens, estradiol and estradiol. And we're going to talk about 21-hydroxylase and this desmolase, cholesterol desmolase, because you have mutations. Well, if you have a mutation in cholesterol desmolase, you're dead. You can't live without this. You have to be able to make pregnenolone. So we can see how important. If you have a mutation 21-hydroxylase, you can't make aldosterone. You can't make cortisol. You're dead. You can still make DHEA in testosterone and estrogens, but that's not going to do you any good. So we'll talk about that more, though, when the time comes. Who triggers the release of the adrenal steroids? Well, we know angiotensin II from the member of the R2A system. That stimulates the zona glomerulosa, the granulosa cells, to release aldosterone. We know that already. And then we don't know too much about, well, you might, but we haven't talked too much about ACTH, Adrenocorticotropic Hormone. That triggers the release of DHEA and the glucocorticoids, cortisol, namely. And it also triggers a little bit of release of aldosterone as well. So ACTH is a pretty cool molecule, which we better talk about right now. Let's talk about it. So there it is. There's some AKAs for ACTH. I mean, the full name. You won't see ATH on a board question, by the way. They don't allow it. So it'll be Adrenocorticotropic Hormone is what you will see. Some AKAs are corticotropin, which is shorter, so that might easily pop up there, or adrenocorticotropin, so make sure you know those AKAs. It is a corticotroph. just like MSH, the corticotrophs. There's a family of corticotrophs, and sometimes that's called the adrenocorticotropin family. And yeah, they're secreted from corticotroph cells. So that makes sense. A member of the corticotrophs family comes from corticotroph cells that live in the anterior pituitary. Okay. ACTH, there's other corticotrophs like MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormone. But ACTH, that's the only corticotroph that there's no question of what it does in humans. There's no dispute. Even MSH is probably, there's not a whole bunch of dispute, but it's still not 100% in stone. But ACTH is the only one that we know for sure what it does. And what it does, it stimulates mainly the adrenal cortex, specifically the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, to release cortisol, and zona reticularis to release DHEA, or the adrenal androgens, or glucocorticoids. And we can also stimulate the zona glomerulosa to release a little bit of aldosterone too. Right, as I said, there are some other corticotroph cells, and melanocyting MSH, melanocyte stimulating hormones, are another family of these. The alpha, beta, and gamma types of melanocyte stimulating hormones are known. The alphas are the only ones we really know. We have a pretty good idea what they do. Beta and gamma, I won't even talk about. There's some theories about them, but we won't talk about them. So, what does ACTH do? It stimulates the zona fasciculata. We said that, which is in the zona reticularis. Oh, and the zona reticularis to release the hormones. We said this, cortisol and DHEA. Probably could have taken that slide out. And they stimulate the zona glomerulosa a little bit to release aldosterone. Probably could have taken that one out too. All right, now how is it made? How do you make ACTH and alpha MSH? Well, it's only made by corticotroph cells that live in the anterior pituitary. So specifically, there's a hormone that stimulates those cells to get into gear, turns on genes to make something called POMC, which is the precursor of ACTH. And this hormone lives in the hypothalamus. Specifically, it lives in an area we've talked about, and it's made in a neuron we talked about. It's made by parvocellular neurons, not magnocellular neurons do not make ACTH. Parvocellular neurons make ACTH. What else do they make? Oh, it says right there. A little bit of thyrotropin releasing hormone, but what else do they make? They're pretty multifunctional, aren't they? They make ADH. Remember we talked about ADH. They do make a little of ADH. Oh, it says that right there too. So yeah, they're pretty versatile little neurons there. They live in the paraventricular nuclei, P and P. Paraventricular nuclei contains parvocellular neurons. Okay, there's some magnocellular neurons in that nuclei as well. All right, so after the parvocellular neurons are stimulated, they produce corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. And that travels through axons, just like magnocellular. Remember, magnocellular neurons has those really long axons. They go all the way down to the posterior pituitary. That's not the case with these axons. They only travel down a little bit. They're short and stubby. The CRH is going to eventually make it down to the anterior pituitary through a portal system. And I guess I'm going to overview what happens to it. So CRH is going to travel to the anterior through a portal system we'll look at. They're going to bind to corticotroph cells. Specifically, they bind to CRH-R1 receptors. There's different receptors. There's some receptors for ADH on there as well. But that's who they bind to. And the binding stimulates the release of something called POMC, or pro-opiomelanocortin. pro-opiomelanocortin. That's POMC. Right, so here's kind of an overview, nice drawing somebody made. There's our parvocellular neurons. This is the hypothalamus. There's the magnocellular neurons there. Remember, those guys have those really long axons. They carry ADH in little vesicles, little capsules, and they carry it all the way down here, and it's stored in the nerve endings and released when it's necessary. Not the deal with parvocellular neurons. They have shorter axons, and they dump into this median eminence. Right, that's right above the stalk of the pituitary. The stalk wasn't drawn way out here just so you can see things better. So it's right above the stalk, and that's the portal system. Hypophyseal portal system is the name of it specifically. And they dump into here, and then they flow down. The current flow is this way. So they flow down into here and are released into the corticotroph cells. Corticotroph cells release POMC, which converted to ACTH, and it's off through these arteries, the ACTH there. That's kind of the route that this stuff takes. Okay, so pro-opiomelanocorticotropin is immediately acted on by an enzyme, and it's called PC1, prohormone convertase 1. That actually gives us a pro-ACTH enzyme, which is again double acted on by PC1. It's double cleaved. And I just left that. I think we're getting too deep into the weeds here. But PC1 ultimately creates ACTH right in the interstitium next to the corticotroph cells. Board question might not go that deep. Easy ones won't even say anything about POMC. They'll just say CRH causes the release of ACTH. But the more difficult board questions might actually go into POMC. So you should know that if you're aiming to crush boards. All right, PC1 lives in the kind of the interstitium of the stroma, you could call it, of the anterior pituitary. I like to call it the interstitium. In the skin, there is another PC hormone. It's called prohormone convertase 2. That one hangs out right at the dermal epidermal junction where melanocytes live. And if you get a huge level of ACTH, like in diseases of the adrenal gland where cortisol can't be released, and ACTH tries and tries and tries to make it released, and you get high levels of ACTH, the ATH can start to soak into the skin and come in contact with PC2. ACTH, or PC2 then cleaves a chunk off of ACTH and makes a new molecule from it called alpha melanocyte stimulating hormone. And that guy does just what it says. It stimulates melanocytes to inject neighboring keratinocytes with melanin, right? Look at your skin color right now. Is it light color? Your melanocytes aren't super active. Is it really dark in color? Your melanocytes are quite busy and quite active. The darker your skin is, the more active and possibly the more dense the melanocytes are in people of color. So people who have Addisons disease, if it's severe, they can get a bronzing color of their skin because of this mechanism, as we'll look at next time. So I like this. I love my biochemistry. Here's CRH stimulating corticotroph cell in the anterior pituitary to spit out POMC. PC1 is right there and cleaves it into a pro-hormone, pro-ACTH, and a beta LPH, which we're not going to worry about. But it's acted again. It cleaves it again and cuts it and makes a couple products here. The only one we really care about is ACTH. This is the key one. But if levels get high and it starts to get into the dermis in the epidermal junction, PC2 lives there, right? Thought to occur in the skin. And it can cleave ACTH into a new molecule called alpha MSH, which stimulates melanocytes to make you dark. For those of you who like this kind of deal, here's a POMC molecule. PC1 is in green. It cuts, here's ACTH, but it cuts it twice to form ACTH. Or I guess there's two cleavage. It cleaves this chunk out of the POMC molecule, and then that chunk, that's the pro-ACTH. That has to be cleaved again. Did they not show pro? No, they didn't show pro. They just went to ACTH. And so ACTH, if it gets high enough quantities in the blood, this piece can be cleaved away and form alpha MSH. And this is CLIP, and we don't need to worry about this. We don't need to worry about beta. This is also involved in the endorphin pathway, which we're not going to get into that. Okay. Don't forget, ADH also stimulates corticotroph cells, as I said, but now it's in writing, so testable. Remember, some parvocellular neurons in the paraventricular nuclei of the hypothalamus, they secrete ADH, and we said that ADH travels down through that hypophyseal portal system. It travels down to the anterior pituitary, just like CRH does, and it binds to corticotroph cells, and we won't worry about those receptors. But this binding weakly stimulates the release of POMC. Okay, although CRH is a much more powerful stimulant for the release of POMC than ADH is. Okay, here's the official route. Now, I knew this was in here somewhere. How does it get to the anterior pituitary? Where parvocellular neurons are short and stubby, that picture we showed you already, and they only project into a capillary bed at the bottom of the hypothalamus. So right under the hypothalamus, the connecting piece between the stalk of the pituitary and the hypothalamus, there's a connecting piece, and that's called the median eminence. And that's where the capillary beds live. And so POMs, or the Adrenocorticotropic Hormone, CRH is dumped right into this this vascular system here, and it's actually a portal system, and it's a hypophyseal portal system actually, and then they travel down to the corticotroph cells. Here's another diagram. There's the ADH showing you magnocellular neurons, magna because they have these big, long neurons. But here's the parvocellular neurons are really short, but they dump into this little hypophyseal portal system here. And there's a long and a short, and we won't get into all the different parts of that circulatory system. But they end up down here in the anterior pituitary where the corticotroph cells are. And they stimulate them to make POMC, which is converted by PC1 to ACTH. Got it? Some fun facts. There are other CRH-containing neurons in the CNS that we're not going to get into, but there are some weird ones, and we don't know what they do. But there are receptors for corticotropin-releasing hormone. We don't know what they do. Also, CRH is produced by the placenta, and there's a role in embryology about that, but we're not going to get into that. So it does do some other things. This is important. I always ask questions on the test about regulation. Boards every professors like regulation. Everybody likes regulation. So how is CRH regulated? It's actually regulated by the end product. What's the end product of CRH? Let's see, did I turn on my... I sure did. So CRH goes down, ultimately gives rise to ACTH through POMC. There's got to be a better way to draw on this. Of course, this is just my laptop. ACTH ultimately gives rise to... the key one here is cortisol, right? So a feedback system occurs when the product of the kind of cycle goes back. Actually, let's make this red. The product goes back and it inhibits the manufacturing of CRH So it binds to parvocellular neurons and shuts down this mechanism. So you can't make CRH anymore. It also goes back here and binds to corticotroph cells just in case something messes up here. It's a double negative feedback system. So it binds to corticotroph cells and inhibits that way. So therefore, it decreases cortisol. Once the blood levels of cortisol get used up and there's not enough around, all this goes away and this starts working again until enough cortisol builds up and then it shuts it down again. That's a classic negative feedback cycle. In fact, this is a double negative feedback cycle. Okay, pretty basic stuff. All right, everything I just said. So increased cortisol binds to glucocorticoid receptors on parvocellular neurons and inhibits them to make not only CRH, but ADH as well. Cortisol also binds to glucocorticoid receptors on corticotroph cells in the anterior pituitary and stops them from making POMC. If no POMC is around, you can't make ACTH. Everything I just said. All right, and there it is. Back when I'm in lecture mode in class, I don't draw this stuff, but it's kind of fun to draw it. All right, so there's that system. I don't need to go through that again. Oh, what about stress, right? Everybody hears, the mainstream media knows about cortisol and stress. You always see ads, and it's true. So stress somehow discombobulates that negative feedback inhibition system when we're not exactly sure the mechanism, but we know it's true. So normally if you have high levels of cortisol floating around, let's go back to this thing. Normally if you have high levels of cortisol floating around, right, it inhibits up here the parvocellular neurons and it inhibits the corticotroph cells. Somehow stress just screws up this inhibition. We don't know what it is. If the binding of cortisol doesn't work anymore, we don't know for 100% sure what it is. That's what it's thought to be. Somehow it turns on genes which make the receptors no longer amenable to cortisol. And so you can't bind cortisol to shut the machinery. So cortisol just gets cranked out more and more. The more stress you get, the more and more cortisol get kicked out. And that's detrimental. We'll look at all the functions of cortisol. But yeah, there's all, I mean, it can kick you into diabetes. You can have too much blood sugar released from that, amongst other things. So we'll look at that nasty cortisol molecule. Right, so everything I just said right there. I don't think I missed anything. All right, what about ACTH versus the adrenal androgens? How come I'm not talking about them? Well, of course, they stimulate the release of the AAs, the adrenal androgens. DHEA is the main one, androstenedione, and DHEA, so probably the three big ones. You can see the question, right? Which one of the following is not one of the adrenal androgens, or blank is not a member of the adrenal androgen family? So that'd be a nice little question, wouldn't it? Yeah. So some believe in addition to ACTH, though, there is something that helps stimulate the release. So we think that the ACTH is the only hormone known to stimulate adrenal androgens. But there is some new research. It's not in board books or any books, so I won't worry about it. But there is some other molecules that are thought to, in addition to ACTH, to stimulate the release of the adrenal androgens, some unknown pituitary hormone X. For board purposes, don't worry about that. But there's probably more to the story that's coming in the next 5 years or so. Also, the childhood, you don't release much of this stuff during childhood, which is interesting, very low levels. Some more fun facts: the three AAs, the adrenal androgens, DHEA, DHEAS, androstenedione, those are also the major androgens in women. Remember, they don't have testicles. They have ovaries, which help a little bit, but not after they're 50 years old or so. So that's their major source of testosterone after menopause. Androstenedione is the one that was in the news back in the 80s. The athletes were cheating with giving injections of this because I won't get into the mechanism, but normally your ratio of testosterone to epitestosterone is the active form of testosterone. This is kind of the reserve that floats around, can be converted to epitestosterone. Normally, it's 2-to-1 ratio. They found in the 80s that after injecting androstenedione, the ratio in the blood was 14-to-1. And so it was a huge advantage, and it took them a long time to test for that. So people used to use that for cheating. It's like a way, might as well be injecting testosterone. And too much epitestosterone has some great benefits. It greatly increases protein synthesis, and therefore, it decreases the recovery time for muscles. So it should be decreases, greatly increases protein synthesis and recovery for muscles recovery from muscle breakdown. Let me put a note. I might need to go kind of tidy that slide up a bit. Let's look at 286. Because steroids, there's no question that they work. But if they don't make you strong, you don't get big muscles and strength and faster just by taking it. It allows you, the trick of all these, the testosterone based, it allows you to train much harder and recover so much faster. That's the key for it. So what you can accomplish in 3 years of work without testosterone, probably in 6 months you can accomplish that work just because of the ability to recover and train harder. That's kind of the falsehood. People think you inject steroids and they make you strong. It just allows you to train a lot harder. That's the trick. It does increase the synapse, the speed between some of the gaps, and so it does that as well. But we won't get into that. So what about in females? We're going to talk about Cushing's syndrome here pretty soon. Since we're talking about the AAs, the adrenal androgens. Does that say antigens? That does say. I've got to fix that slide too. That's 287. You can see I just majorly overdid these slides this morning. But we'll talk about Cushing's syndrome. But in females, it's not life-threatening. An overproduction of the adrenal androgens is not life-threatening. But what do you do? What happens to females if they have testosterone flowing through their brain, through their blood at the same level as the males? They become masculinized, or virilized is another word for that. If you don't know that, virilization is the same, aka for masculinization. So add that to your vocabulary if you don't know that word. Don't ask me on the test what that means, like some people try to do. So there goes their breasts. Their breasts start shrinking up. Their voice starts to deepen, more like a guy's voice, and they start getting hairy. They start developing facial hair like this poor child has done here. Right, here's, did we look at this yet? I think we did, but yeah, we did. We already looked at this, but here it is again, just showing the DHEAs, how they do go into testosterone and estrogen. I think we pretty much talked about that. Okay, we kind of said this already. DHEA also is responsible for pubic hair and the hair under your arms that you grow when you're about 12 years old. That's anarchy begins, or andrenarchy. It's like is anarchy. They want to take over the family at that age. That's a tough age for some parents, as you will find out when you get there. I have 5 kids, so I can tell you from firsthand experience, some kids are no problem, some kids are monsters. Anyway, so once your hormones start flowing around 12 or so, your DHEA starts ramping up as well, and that is what causes the growth of pubic hair and axillary hair. It's also responsible for body odor. Won't get into that mechanism. As kids start smelling at that age. Little kids should never have body odor, right? That's a sign that there might be something wrong. It also stimulates the production of sebum from sebaceous glands, and too much sebum clogs up the pores, the skin pores, and bacteria get trapped underneath there, and they eat sebum. They love it, and they grow, and the body sees this growth of bacteria, inflammation starts, and you got yourself a pimple. ACTH absence, so removal or disease of the pituitary. What about decreased ACTH? Well, that means if you don't have ACTH, you're not going to have any cortisol. You're not going to have any adrenal androgens, which is the least of your problems. But, I mean, you can't live without cortisol, so you will die from that if something's not done. It's not going to affect the aldosterone level, though, right? Because aldosterone is produced by angiotensin II in the R2A system. So it won't have a tiny effect on that, because ACTH does cause a little bit of aldosterone function, but you would never know the difference. And yeah, that decreased ACTH causes hypoadrenalism, and we'll talk about that right now. Well, let's save that for next week. Don't want to pile too much on you. It's getting close to midterm time, right? This is week 4. Labs are next week. All the lab finals are next week, or midterms are next week, and then you can stagger your GIGU with your CVP. I really don't care which one you do first. It's up really to you guys. Just let me know. All right, we'll see. Let's see. That's our second endocrinology, so I'll see you next week for endocrinology.